Shiva Bad, soaking wet, trembling, and carrying documents that claimed she belonged to him. He was a widower with mud on his boots and a daughter asleep upstairs who still cried for her mother some nights. He had nothing left to give anyone. She was a billionaire who had lost everything: her family, her empire, her name, stripped away by a man so powerful that courts, banks, and newspapers had all bent to his will. When Mason Reed opened that door in the middle of a Montana storm, he had no idea that the woman standing in the rain would tear his quiet, carefully rebuilt life completely apart, and that she would be the reason he finally wanted to live it again. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one is going to take everything you've got. The storm came in from the northwest the way Montana storms always did: fast, mean, and without much warning. Mason Reed had been watching it build since late afternoon, a wall of purple-black clouds stacking up along the ridgeline, like something prehistoric trying to climb over. He'd moved the horses in early, double-latched the barn, and dragged 3 bales of hay inside before the first fat drops started falling. By 7 o'clock, rain was hammering the tin roof of the farmhouse hard enough that he had to raise his voice to read to his daughter. "Keep going, Daddy," Lily said. She was 6 years old and already understood, with the particular wisdom of children who've seen too much too early, that storms were just noise. She pulled her quilt tighter and pointed at the book. "You stopped at the part where the horse runs away." "I know where I stopped." "You always stop there, because that's where the chapter ends." "No, it isn't. You just don't like that part." Mason looked down at her. She had her mother's eyes, that pale gray-green that changed depending on the light, the kind of eyes that made you feel seen even when you didn't want to be. He'd spent the last 3 years trying to figure out how to raise a child who had those eyes and who watched him the way Claire used to watch him, like she was always one step ahead of whatever he was about to say. "Fine," he said. "The horse runs away. The boy chases him into the dark. Happy?" "That's not reading it." He went back to the page. Outside, the wind picked up and something metallic scraped across the yard, probably the feed bucket he'd forgotten to bring in. He made a mental note to check the fence along the eastern pasture in the morning. The post near the creek had been leaning for 2 weeks, and he kept pushing the repair back because there was always something else, always another fire to put out, always another bill that showed up a few $100s larger than he'd budgeted for. He read 3 more pages before Lily's eyelids started to droop. He tucked the quilt around her, turned off the lamp on her nightstand, and stood in the doorway for a moment the way he always did. Not because she needed him to, but because he needed the reminder that this was why he got up at 5 every morning. This one small person who was going to inherit his stubbornness and Claire's intelligence and somehow make something out of both. He went downstairs, poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey he didn't really need, and sat at the kitchen table with the ranch's accounting spreadsheet open on his laptop. The numbers hadn't improved since the last time he'd looked at them. They never did. The Reedwood Ranch had been in his family for 3 generations. 92 acres of grazing land, a creek that ran cold and clear most of the year, a farmhouse that needed a new roof on the back addition, and a livestock operation that was slowly losing ground to larger commercial outfits. His grandfather had run cattle at a profit. His father had barely broken even. Mason was somewhere between breaking even and drowning, and he'd been swimming in that particular stretch of water long enough that he'd stopped panicking about it. You made the payment or you didn't. You fixed what you could fix. You got up the next day. That was the whole philosophy. Claire used to tease him about it, called it Montana stoicism, with a tone that was half admiring and half exasperated. She'd wanted him to have bigger plans. He'd told her the ranch was his plan. They'd argued about it exactly once, and then she'd gotten sick, and after that they never argued about anything as small as plans again. He was on his 3rd column of numbers when he heard it. At first he thought it was the storm. The wind did strange things to sound out here, carried voices from the highway 3 miles away sometimes, turned the creak of fence wire into something almost human. He'd heard plenty of things in the dark that turned out to be nothing, but this wasn't nothing. 3 knocks, hard, deliberate, coming from the front door. Mason sat very still for a second. Nobody came to his door at 9:30 on a Wednesday night in the middle of a storm. His nearest neighbor was Dale Hutchins, and Dale would have called first. The UPS driver didn't come this far after dark. And strangers in rural Montana at this hour, were either lost, in trouble, or both. He pushed back from the table and went to the window first, pulling the curtain aside. The porch light was on. In its yellow circle, he could see rain slanting sideways in the shape of a person. Small, hunched, soaked completely through. A woman. He went to the door and opened it. She was maybe 30, though it was hard to tell with the rain plastering her dark hair flat against her face. She was wearing what had probably been a nice coat at some point, tailored, expensive fabric, but it was soaked so thoroughly it looked like she'd walked through a river. Her shoes were wrong for the weather, low heels that were now caked with mud all the way to the ankle. She was holding a leather satchel against her chest with both arms, the way you hold something you're terrified of losing. She was shaking. Not just from the cold. He'd seen that particular kind of shaking before, in animals that had been chased to exhaustion, something deep and involuntary. "Can I help you?" he said, which was a stupid thing to say. Obviously, she needed help. But he didn't know her, and there was a sleeping child upstairs, and a woman showing up at his door in these conditions at this hour had about 15 different possible explanations, and he didn't like most of them. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark brown and extremely direct, even now, even with mascara streaked across her cheekbones, and her lips the pale bluish color that came from extended exposure to cold rain. There was something in her face that struck him immediately. Not beauty, though she was that, but a kind of controlled intensity. Like someone who was used to walking into rooms and taking them over, and was now expending enormous effort to hold that quality together while everything else about her was falling apart. "Mason Reed?" she said. He blinked. "Yeah." "My name is Victoria Sterling." She shifted the satchel, opened it with fingers that were visibly clumsy from the cold, and pulled out a document, a thick folder, slightly damp at the edges. She held it out to him. "I know this is going to sound insane, but I need you to not shut the door until I've explained." He didn't reach for the folder. "How do you know my name?" "Because your property is in these documents. Because someone put it there without your knowledge, and without mine." Her jaw tightened. "And because the man who arranged it is trying to destroy both of us, and I've been driving for 6 hours trying to get here before he does something worse." Mason looked at her for a long moment. The rain hammered the porch roof. Water was running off the gutters in sheets. "Come inside," he said. Yeah. He put a towel on this kitchen chair before he let her sit down, which she noticed but didn't comment on. He made coffee without asking if she wanted any, because she looked like she needed it, and put a second mug on the table along with a bottle of whiskey in case the coffee wasn't enough. She wrapped both hands around the mug and didn't drink it right away, just held it. Some of the shaking started to ease. "You're not going to look at the documents first?" she asked. "I'll get to them." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "Talk first." She studied him for a second, measuring, assessing, the way someone does when they're deciding how much to trust a stranger. He got the impression this was not a woman who trusted easily or often. Under different circumstances, he suspected she was the kind of person who walked into a meeting having already read everything about everyone in the room. "My family owns Sterling Meridian Group," she said. "Logistics, real estate, private equity. My father built it over 30 years. She stopped, looked at the table. 8 months ago he died. They said it was a heart attack. You don't believe that." She met his eyes. "I believe that convenient heart attacks happen to men who are about to expose criminal activity, but I can't prove that yet, so—" She cut herself off and seemed to deliberately set that thought aside, the way you push a plate away when you're not ready to deal with what's on it. After he died, a man named Damian Cross moved quickly. He had documents, loan agreements, supposedly, signed by my father in the last months of his life. Loans that leveraged almost every major asset in the company as collateral. Loans that defaulted within 6 weeks. Forged? Yes, but sophisticated enough that the banks didn't catch it immediately, and by the time the fraud investigators started asking questions, Cross had already filed the collateral claims and gotten 3 different judges to issue asset freezes. She took a breath. "He's been buying judges for years. That's the part I can prove. That's the part that got me into this mess." "Tell me where I come in." She opened the folder she'd been clutching. The document on top was several pages long, dense with legal language, and his name was right there in the third paragraph. Mason Reed, Reedwood Ranch, Keller County, Montana. He took the pages, read them again. "This says you've been remanded to my custody," he said slowly, "under a civil debt recovery agreement. The hell does that even mean? It doesn't mean anything legal. That's the point." Her voice was tight but steady. "Cross invented an obligation, a supposed old debt owed by my family to a shell company he controls, which happens to be registered to an address 2 counties from here. He fabricated the paperwork to say that as part of settling that debt, I've been—" She stopped and laughed, a short, harsh sound that had nothing happy in it. "Assigned, that's the word they used. Assigned to perform labor in lieu of payment at the property listed." Mason set the papers down. "That's not legal." "No, it's not. It's designed to be just confusing enough that by the time anyone sorts it out, he's accomplished what he actually wants, which isn't to send me to a ranch in Montana. It's to have me somewhere without resources, without access to my accounts, without anyone who'll take my calls seriously." "What does he actually want?" She looked at him directly. "There's evidence. Documents my parents hid years ago when they first started to suspect Cross was moving against them. I know it exists. He knows I know it exists. He needs me isolated and discredited long enough to find and destroy it before I can get to it." Mason was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm was letting up slightly. The rain still heavy, but the edge taken off the wind. He could hear the horses shifting in the barn, the particular restless sound they made when the weather was changing. "How'd you end up at my door?" he said. "Specifically?" "Because when I saw the documents, before I was supposed to report here, I hired someone to research the property. I wanted to know what I was walking into." She looked at him with that same direct measuring quality. "I found out about your wife. I found out about the ranch. I found out you've been fighting to keep this place together for 3 years on your own." A pause. "And I made a judgment call that you were the kind of person I could be honest with." That was either the most straightforward thing anyone had said to him in years, or it was extremely well calculated to sound that way. He wasn't sure yet which one it was. "You could have gone to the police," he said. "The local sheriff in the county where I filed my first complaint is on Cross's payroll. The state-level fraud division opened an investigation, which Cross then had transferred to a federal task force where he has a contact. I have one investigator I trust, and she's working the case from a location Cross doesn't know about. But right now," she pressed her lips together, "right now I have nowhere to go. He's frozen my accounts. My apartment lease was somehow terminated. I'm still figuring out how he managed that. My executive assistant of 4 years stopped returning my calls 48 hours ago, which means he got to her too. I drove here in a rental car I paid for with a personal credit card that still works because it's under a slightly different name than my usual accounts." She said all of this evenly, the way you recite a list of storm damage. Here's what's broken, here's what's gone. There was something almost worse about the evenness than if she'd been falling apart. "How much money do you have right now?" he asked. "Practically speaking." She thought about it. "A little over $4,000. He almost said something, then decided not to. A billionaire with $4,000 to her name. He didn't know whether to find that absurd or awful, and he was leaning toward both. "You can sleep in the second bedroom," he said. "It's not fancy." Something moved in her face, quick and complicated. Relief, and under it something that looked like it cost her considerably to let show. "Thank you. I'm going to need the rest of it tomorrow," he said. "Everything. Not the version where you tell me what you think I need to know. The whole thing." She nodded. "And I'm going to need you to understand something." He leaned forward slightly. "My daughter is 6 years old. Whatever is following you, it doesn't come anywhere near her. That's not negotiable." "Understood." "I mean it, Ms. Sterling." "Victoria," she said, "and I understand. I have my own reasons for keeping a 6-year-old out of this." He went to the hall closet and pulled out a stack of clean towels and a spare set of clothes. A flannel shirt, an old pair of sweatpants with a drawstring. Things Claire had never gotten around to donating. Things he'd kept because getting rid of them had always felt like something he'd do next month. He brought them back and set them on the table. "Bathroom's at the top of the stairs. I'll show you the room." She picked up the clothes, and for just a moment, looking down at the flannel shirt, her composed expression slipped. Her throat moved. She set her jaw and looked back up. "This is... Thank you," she said. "I know you didn't have to let me in." "I haven't decided yet whether I made the right call," he said honestly. "Ask me in the morning." Why? He didn't sleep well. He lay on top of his covers and listened to the storm finish passing through, the rain tapering to a drizzle and then silence. And he thought about the documents she'd shown him, about the name Damien Cross, which he'd never heard and now couldn't get out of his head, about the way she'd held that coffee mug like it was an anchor, about her saying she'd researched him, found out about Claire. That should have bothered him more than it did. He was a private person by nature and by preference. He didn't talk about Claire to most people he'd known for years. The idea of a stranger digging into his life as a tactical decision should have made him want to throw her back out into the rain. Instead, he lay there trying to work out the angle. Because he wasn't stupid, and he knew there was always an angle, and he couldn't find one that made sense. If Cross had sent her here to manipulate him somehow, she'd done a terrible job of it, arriving with no money, no clear story, soaking wet and shaking in a way that didn't look performed. If she was running some kind of con, the setup was elaborate to the point of absurd. Or she was exactly what she said she was. A woman who'd had everything taken from her and had driven through a Montana storm to knock on a stranger's door because she'd run out of other options. He thought about his daughter sleeping 20 feet down the hall, and the documents downstairs with his name in them, and the fence line that needed repairing, and the spreadsheet with numbers that didn't add up. Then he stopped thinking about all of it, because thinking about it at midnight didn't fix any of it, and he slept. Lily found her at 7 in the morning. Mason heard his daughter's footsteps on the stairs. Her particular stomp, stomp, stomp that was too loud for someone so small. And then a pause where the kitchen should have been, and then a voice. "Are you a princess?" He was already pulling on a shirt. He got to the kitchen doorway fast enough to see Victoria Sterling standing at his kitchen counter in his wife's flannel shirt and oversized sweatpants, holding a spatula, looking down at his daughter with an expression of pure, startled uncertainty. The uncertainty lasted about 2 seconds. Then she crouched down to Lily's level, which was something adults rarely did, and said, "No. Why would you think that?" "Because you're really pretty, and you came during a storm," Lily said, with the absolute seriousness of a 6-year-old presenting evidence. "That's how princesses come." "Lily," Mason said. "It's true," Lily said, not looking at him. Victoria glanced up at Mason, and for just a moment her mouth curved. Not a polished smile, something smaller and more genuine. Then she looked back at Lily. "I'm not a princess. My name is Victoria. I'm a person who needed help, and your dad let me stay." "Daddy lets lots of things stay," Lily said sagely. "We have 3 cats. I've met 2 of them." Victoria looked at the counter. "I was making eggs. I hope that's okay. I needed something to do, and I didn't know how to ask." "You don't have to ask," Mason said. Then, "There's coffee." "I made that too." He went to the counter and poured a mug. It was better coffee than he usually made. He didn't comment on it. Lily climbed onto her chair and watched Victoria cook with the focused attention of a child who has decided someone is interesting and is collecting data. Mason stood near the window and drank his coffee and thought about the fence line and the documents on the kitchen table and the fact that there was a billionaire in his kitchen making scrambled eggs in his dead wife's old clothes. Stranger mornings had probably happened in Montana. He couldn't think of one at the moment. "You're good at that," Lily said, watching Victoria fold the eggs. "I used to cook a lot before I had people doing it for me," Victoria said. "Then I had people doing it for me for too long, and I forgot what it felt like." "What did it feel like?" Victoria considered this with apparent seriousness. "Normal," she said. It felt normal. She put the eggs on the table in 3 portions, which meant she'd already counted the plates, already figured out how many people lived here, already done that small social calculation without being asked. Mason noticed. He thought about how a person who'd run a corporation for years must do that constantly, map the room before anyone else has finished sitting down. They ate without much conversation. Lily ate fast the way she always did, already thinking about whatever she was planning to do outside. The rain had stopped completely. The sky through the kitchen window was the particular washed-out blue that followed Montana storms, pale and clean. "I have to go check on something," Mason said, pushing back from the table. "Victoria." She looked up. When Lily goes out to feed the chickens, you stay on the porch where you can see her. It was a test, partially. He wanted to see how she'd take being given an instruction. She didn't bristle, didn't argue, just nodded once. Okay. He went out to the barn. The eastern fence was worse than he'd thought. 3 posts were leaning at angles that meant they'd come down in the next heavy wind, and there was a section of wire about 40 feet long that had been pushed out. Not broken, pushed, like something large had pressed against it repeatedly. The hoof prints on both sides of the line suggested the horses had spent part of last night here, probably spooked by the storm and milling against the fence. He made the repairs manually, the way he always did. No shortcuts, no skipping steps. Driving the posts back in, resetting the wire, tying off at the corners. It took 2 hours and left his hands sore and his boots muddy to mid-calf. When he got back to the house, Victoria was on the porch with a cup of coffee and his laptop open in front of her, and Lily was in the yard collecting eggs from the chicken coop with the 2 calico cats following her around like they always did. "I didn't open it," Victoria said when she saw where he was looking. The sight of a laptop is a reflex at this point. "You can use it," he said, "but I want to see what you're doing." "Still testing me." "Still testing you," he agreed. She turned the screen to show him. A browser window, multiple tabs. Financial news. Her own name in 3 of the search results. All the same story, slightly different words. Sterling heiress, linked to fraudulent loan scheme. Former CEO's daughter under investigation. She wasn't reading them, he noticed. The tabs were open, but she wasn't looking at them. "How long has that been out there?" he asked. 10 days. Cross has people who work media. I've dealt with it before on smaller scales, on bad press during a deal, a competitor planning a story. She paused. "This is different. He's not trying to damage my reputation. He's trying to replace it, make me into a character in a story he's writing." "And what character is that?" "Unhinged daughter of a failed businessman, delusional, possibly criminal." She said it without visible emotion, but her jaw was tight. "If you can get that story established firmly enough before I produce the evidence, then when I do produce it, people will already have a frame to put it in." Mason sat down on the porch steps. "Tell me about the evidence, specifically." She closed the laptop. "My father wasn't a naive man. He grew up without money and built something that took him 30 years and more failures than I knew about until recently. He understood that people who build things become targets." She looked out at the yard. "He told me once, when I was maybe 20 and we were arguing about corporate security, that the most important documents in any deal are the ones nobody knows exist. Meaning, he kept records Cross doesn't know about." "I think so. The problem is that after his death, his private files were seized as part of the asset freeze. Everything at the main office, his personal computer, his home office. But there was a property, not in his name, held under a trust my mother established in the early years of the company before they had anything worth protecting. It wasn't in the main inventory because it's technically a family property, not a business asset." "Where?" She looked at him. "About 40 minutes from here." He took that in. "That's why the document put you at this ranch," he said. "Cross didn't pick this location randomly." "No." Her voice was careful and even. "I don't think he did. I think he knows about the property. I think he chose your ranch because it's close enough to make the assignment plausible. And because—" She stopped. "Because what?" She looked away again. "Because ranchers in financial trouble are easy to pressure. If he needed leverage over you later, he'd have it." The words landed flatly. Mason sat with them for a moment. He wasn't surprised exactly. He'd suspected there was a reason for the specific location. But hearing it said plainly, the calculated way she described it, easy to pressure, something tightened in his chest. Not fear. Something more like anger, the low-banked kind that burns steady rather than hot. "You know how much trouble my ranch is in?" he asked. "Probably most of it." She turned back to him. "I'm sorry. I know that's not a comfortable thing to hear. I've heard less comfortable things." He stood up. "I need to make some calls. People I trust. A couple of ranchers in the area, a lawyer I've known since my father's time. If Cross has been looking at this property, I want to know if there's been any other movement. That's smart. And we need to talk about that property you mentioned, the one with your father's files. I know. Not today. Tomorrow, maybe, when I've had time to think through the risks. She nodded. There was something in her posture that shifted when he said that. Not quite relief, more like the particular kind of stillness a person assumes when they've been waiting for someone to believe them, and someone finally does. He wasn't sure what to do with that, so he left it alone. Lily came running up from the yard with a basket of eggs, and both cats trailing her, breathless and pink-cheeked, already starting a sentence before she'd hit the porch steps. Daddy, Victoria says she used to have horses, and I asked her if she could come see ours, and she said to ask you. Tomorrow, Mason said. Go wash your hands. Lily disappeared inside. Victoria looked at him, and there was that almost smile again, the real one, the one that came and went quickly, like she wasn't sure yet whether she was allowed to use it here. Thank you, she said. Again. Stop thanking me, he said. I haven't done anything yet. The first phone call Mason made was to Bill Hadley, who ran a cattle operation 30 miles north and had been his father's friend for 40 years. Bill was slow to panic and fast to notice things, and when Mason described the documents in careful, general terms, Bill went quiet for a long time. Damian Cross, Bill said, finally. You know that name? Heard it twice in the last 6 months. Once from a rancher over in Wheatland County who lost his water rights in a deal that didn't make sense. Once from a feed supplier who told me a holding company tried to buy out his contract. A pause. Didn't put it together till just now. Same name both times? Same name. Different company names attached to it, but when I went back and tried to look up who owned them, can't find a clean answer. Layers. Mason stared at the wall of his office. Bill, is there anything happening around here that you know about? Any land deals, any pressure on people to sell? Another pause, this one longer. There's a rumor, Bill said. Hal Morrison over on the Creek Road told me someone came to see him about a month back. Suited up, not from here. Made him an offer on the lower 40. When Hal said no, the man told him the offer wouldn't stay open, and the reason Hal might want to reconsider was that his current lending situation was more fragile than he thought. Bill's voice was flat and careful. Hal didn't tell me the company name, but he said it scared him. Mason ended the call and sat in the quiet of his office. Then he made 2 more calls. His lawyer, who confirmed the document was legally meaningless but also deeply strange and worth tracking, and Dale Hutchins, who ran the small spread to the south, and who told Mason, slowly and with evident reluctance, that 2 men had driven down his access road 3 weeks ago and turned around without stopping, and that Dale had gotten the plate number on instinct but hadn't thought anything of it until this conversation. By the time Mason went back to the kitchen, it was late afternoon, and Victoria was at the table with a yellow legal pad, his legal pad from the drawer by the phone, covered in her handwriting. Small, precise, the kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who takes notes quickly and doesn't want to miss anything. She looked up when he came in. Your ranch wasn't chosen randomly, he said. I know. He's been working this area for months. My neighbors. Multiple properties. He pulled out a chair and sat. This isn't about you and him, or it's not only about that. He's building towards something larger. She turned the legal pad around so he could see it. Names, dates, property locations. I've been trying to map his acquisitions for the last 8 months. Every time I get close to the pattern, I run into a wall of shell companies. She tapped the page. But if what you're telling me matches what I've been building, I think the target is the Keller County Water Corridor. There's a federal infrastructure project, still in early planning stages, mostly internal documents, that would route a major pipeline through land in this area. If Cross owns or controls the right parcels by the time it's announced publicly, he's sitting on a windfall that makes everything he's stolen from my family look modest. Mason looked at the map she'd sketched, rough but detailed. Reedwood Ranch was circled, right in the middle of what she'd marked as the likely corridor. Your property, she said quietly. It would be central. He thought about his grandfather, who'd bought this land when Montana was still mostly empty and the places it wasn't full of cattle and sky. About his father, who'd held on through drought years and bad markets. About 3 years of getting up at 5 in the morning and going to bed with numbers that didn't add up, because this was the only thing left that felt like it meant something. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "All right, what?" "All right, we go get your father's documents." He met her eyes. "But we do it carefully, and we do it my way, on my timeline, with people I trust." She didn't argue. She didn't point out that she'd been managing corporate strategy since she was 25 and probably had opinions about this. She just said, "Yes, okay." And he thought, either she actually trusts me or she's too tired to fight me on it, or she's smart enough to understand that out here, on this land, she doesn't know the terrain and he does. Maybe all three. Probably all three. Lily came clattering down the stairs demanding to know what was for dinner, and the conversation ended, and Mason got up to look in the refrigerator, and Victoria moved to help him without being asked, and outside the washed blue sky was darkening toward evening over the mountains, and somewhere on the other end of a phone line, Damian Cross was making plans neither of them fully knew yet. The ranch was quiet, but it wasn't going to stay that way. The property was called Harlan's Bluff by the locals, though the name appeared nowhere on any official map. It sat on a shallow rise about 38 minutes east of the ranch, past the turnoff toward Keller Creek, and down a dirt road that narrowed to single lane just before the tree line. The house itself was small, a two-bedroom structure that Victoria's mother had registered under a maiden name trust 26 years earlier, during a period when the Sterling family was still building and still paranoid enough about the future to hide things carefully. Mason drove. Victoria sat in the passenger seat of his truck with her hands folded in her lap, watching the road. She'd been quiet since they left the ranch, the specific kind of quiet that wasn't peace but concentration, like she was running through scenarios in her head and not finding good outcomes for most of them. Lily had stayed home with Dale Hutchins' wife, who babysat occasionally, and who Lily tolerated with the particular resignation of a child who understood she had no say in the matter. She'd made Mason promise twice to come back before dark. "Tell me what we're looking for," Mason said. "Exactly. A safe. My father had one custom installed in every property he owned. Always the same location, behind the utility panel in the basement, left side. He thought it was funny to hide things in the most obvious-looking place, because people search everywhere else first. What's in it? If I'm right?" She paused. "Records of every transaction Cross falsified going back at least 7 years. My father had a contact inside Cross's primary accounting firm, a woman who was nervous and careful and sent documents through 3 layers of dead drops before they reached him. He told me about her once, obliquely. I didn't understand what he was telling me at the time. And you think these records are enough to take Cross down? I think they're enough to start." She looked at him. "That's different from enough to finish. But start is something." The dirt road turned rougher past the tree line, and Mason dropped to second gear. The truck handled it without complaint. He'd replaced the shocks 2 years ago, one of the few repairs that had stayed ahead of the decay. Through the trees he could see the shape of the house, small and gray-sided, settled into the hillside like it had grown there. He pulled up and cut the engine, and they both sat for a moment, looking at it. "Someone's been here," Victoria said. He saw it too. The padlock on the front door was new. Not the old kind with weathered brass, a fresh one, shiny enough to catch the morning light. "Cross?" he said. "Or someone working for him?" Her voice was careful. "The question is whether they've already been inside or whether they put the lock on to keep someone out." "Meaning you." "Meaning me." He reached under the seat and pulled out a bolt cutter. The old kind with long handles, the kind his father had kept for cutting fencing. Victoria looked at it, and something in her expression shifted, though she didn't say anything. The new padlock came off in about 20 seconds. The original door lock, the one that had been there for years, took his spare key. Victoria had found it in the trust documents her mother's lawyer had forwarded to her in the first days after her father's death, before Cross had moved to freeze everything. Inside smelled like abandonment, dust and stale air, and faintly underneath something floral that might have been the ghost of a cleaning product used years ago. The furniture was minimal and covered in cloth. The windows were small and let in gray light through grime. "Basement," Victoria said. The door to it was in the kitchen. The stairs were bare wood and creaked on every step. At the bottom, a concrete floor and a single bulb on a pull chain that Mason found by sweeping his hand through the dark until his fingers hit the cord. The utility panel was exactly where she'd said. On the left side, behind a hinged section of drywall that looked like a permanent part of the structure until you pressed the right spot and it swung out, was a fireproof safe bolted to the concrete block wall. Victoria stood very still looking at it. "You okay?" Mason asked. I didn't know for certain it would be here," she said. "I was fairly certain, but there's a difference." She reached into the bag she'd carried down and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The combination, which she'd reconstructed from a memory of her father writing something in a small book, and then the specific way he'd told her, once, that the numbers that mattered were always the ones you already knew. The paper had a sequence of digits in her handwriting. She turned the dial twice before her hands were steady enough to read the marks properly. The safe opened on the fourth try. Inside were 2 sealed manila envelopes, a small external hard drive wrapped in a plastic bag, and a single handwritten note in a man's cramped script that Mason couldn't read from where he stood. Victoria picked up the note first. "Read it." Her face didn't change, but something around her eyes did. Tightened, then released, the way a muscle does when it's been clenched for too long. She folded the note and put it in her pocket without offering to share it. He didn't ask. They came back up the stairs into the gray light of the kitchen, and she sat down at the dusty table and opened the first envelope right there, going through the pages carefully, not fast, reading each one, making small sounds in the back of her throat that weren't words. Mason stood by the window and watched the road. "This is more than I expected," she said finally. "Good more or bad more?" "Both." She set the pages down. "These are internal transfer records. Cross's accounting firm ran the falsified loan documents through a series of accounts they're traceable. They covered it well, but not well enough. My father's contact was very thorough." She looked at the hard drive still wrapped in plastic. "If this has what I think it has, it's not just my family. There are at least 8 other acquisitions in here, going back to 2018. Families who lost properties. Business owners who lost companies." Mason thought about Hal Morrison, over on the Creek Road, and the suited man who'd made him nervous. "How do we get this to someone who can actually use it?" he said. "The investigator I mentioned. Her name is Carla Voss. I've been trying to reach her through a number Cross's people don't know about." She looked up at him. "Can I use your phone? Mine is compromised?" "Possibly. Probably." She said it without drama, just fact. He handed her his phone and walked out the front door to give her privacy, and stood on the narrow porch looking down the dirt road through the trees. The morning was cold and clear. Somewhere in the tree line a bird was making an irritated sound, the specific complaint of something that doesn't want to be near people and has noticed people. He thought about what Bill Hadley had told him. The water corridor, the pipeline, the pattern of acquisitions that made Reedwood Ranch not a coincidence but a target, a coordinate on a map that someone in an office somewhere had marked with a pin. He'd grown up on that land. His grandfather's name was still on the deed of original filing, framed in the hallway. He'd buried Claire in the small cemetery on the eastern rise, between 2 cottonwoods she'd loved because they turned gold in October. He'd built the fence on the north pasture with his own hands at 19, working beside his father on a summer that he could still feel in his shoulders when the weather changed. The idea of someone having decided it was available to pressure, available to take, produced a specific kind of anger that sat low in his gut and didn't move. Victoria came back to the doorway. She answered. Good. She's still active, still working the case from her end. She said the fraud division has been slowly building something on Cross for about 4 months, but they've hit a wall with the financial records. They can't subpoena the accounting firm without tipping off his contact there. She held up the hard drive. She says if these records are what they sound like, it changes the case significantly. How long to get them to her? She's in Denver. She said she can be in the Keller County area day after tomorrow if we need her to come directly. She should come directly, Mason said. I don't want you shipping this anywhere. Victoria nodded. Then, she said something else. A pause. She said Cross's team has been asking questions locally, not just about you, about several ranchers in the county. She thinks he's about to move. Whatever he's been planning, He's accelerating. That word, accelerating, hung in the cold air between them. They drove back to the ranch mostly in silence, the envelopes and the hard drive in a waterproof case from Mason's truck that he usually used for keeping documents dry during wet work. Victoria held it on her lap the whole way without being asked. It was when they turned down the main road toward the ranch that Mason noticed the truck. It was parked half on the shoulder about a quarter-mile from his gate, a black pickup, clean and new, with no visible plates from this distance. As he watched, it pulled slowly forward and turned down a different road before he could get close enough to read anything. "Did you see that?" he asked. "Yes." He pulled over and wrote down what he could remember: make, color, approximate model year, the partial plate he thought he'd caught. It wasn't much. It was something. "He knows where I am," Victoria said. It wasn't a question. "Probably knew before you got here." He folded the note and put it in his jacket. "Which means we need to stop acting like we have time we don't." That evening, after Lily was in bed, they sat at the kitchen table with the pages from the first envelope spread between them and Victoria's yellow legal pad beside the stack, now covered on 3 pages. Mason had made coffee, real coffee this time, not instant, because the situation seemed to require it. "Walk me through the structure," he said. She did. She was good at it. Clear, sequential, no wasted explanation. Cross's operation ran through a parent holding company that had 4 subsidiary layers, each one designed to look like independent entities. The loans falsified against Sterling Meridian Group had been processed through the 3rd layer and backdated using internal accounting records that matched the company's legitimate filing calendar closely enough to fool an initial review. "He's done this before," Mason said. "Exactly this." "Yes. The first one I can trace is 2018, a family in Wyoming, agricultural equipment company. The son tried to fight it in court and ran out of money before it got to trial." "What happened to the family?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I haven't been able to locate them." That silence was its own answer. "How many people know about this?" Mason asked, gesturing at the pages. "The documents, what they contain?" "Right now, you, me, and Carla Voss. Carla's assistant probably, in the sense that Carla doesn't keep secrets well from people she trusts." She thought about it. "And Cross, who knows the documents exist and has been trying to find them for 8 months. He's going to come at the ranch," Mason said. "He's going to make it difficult to stay here." "Yes." She met his eyes. "I know, and I want you to understand something. I didn't come here to put you in that position. When I drove here through the storm, I was out of options, and I made a decision based on—" She stopped, started again. "Based on what I thought I knew about you. But knowing things on paper and actually seeing what I've walked into are different. You have Lily. You have this place that you've—" She gestured vaguely. "That you've held together through things I can't fully understand. And now I've made it a target." "It was already a target," Mason said. "That's what you told me." "Yes, but Victoria." He said it quietly. "I heard you. It was already a target. You showing up didn't create that. You showing up gave me a chance to know about it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked down at the papers. "Thank you," she said. "Stop thanking me and tell me about your father." She blinked. The shift caught her off guard. "What about him?" "What was he like?" "Not the businessman. The man." A long pause. He thought she might not answer. Then she said, "He was stubborn, impatient. He had this habit of finishing other people's sentences when he was tired, and he was wrong about half the time, but never admitted it." The almost smile came and went. "He made very bad coffee. Worse than yours. He thought coffee was a vehicle for getting to the next hour and shouldn't taste like anything in particular." "Mine's bad?" "It's adequate." The smile stayed a little longer this time. He was genuinely good at seeing what mattered in a situation, not just in business, in people. He could read a room in 10 seconds and usually be right about what everyone in it actually wanted, underneath what they were saying. "He'd have read me in under 5, Mason said. "Probably." She was quiet a moment. "He would have liked you, I think. He had a thing about people who showed up and did the work. He called it the difference between someone who means it and someone who means well." Mason thought about that. Then he said, What was in the note? The handwritten one. She looked at the table. He said that if I found this, it meant things had gone wrong in the way he'd feared, and that the most important thing wasn't what was in the safe. She paused. He said the most important thing was to find one person who had reasons of their own to fight, and make sure their interests and mine were pointed in the same direction. Mason sat with that for a moment. He thought ahead, Mason said. He always did. Her voice was steady. He just didn't think he'd run out of time before the threat arrived. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere up the ridge, the long, wavering sound that always made Lily press her face into her pillow on the night she heard it. The house was quiet otherwise. The kitchen light made everything yellow and close. I'm going to call a man named Jerry Fitch in the morning, Mason said. He's a federal agricultural liaison, handles land use disputes, and has contacts in the fraud division. I've known him since a water rights case 3 years ago. He's careful, and he's not connected to anything local. You think you can trust him? I think I trust him more than I trust anyone Cross might know. He started stacking the papers carefully. He'll know how to bring Carla Voss in without it looking like a meeting. Victoria watched him stack the papers with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not quite relief, not quite something else. He handed the stack to her because her instinct to hold the documents had been visible from the moment they'd left Harlan's bluff, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. She took them and didn't say anything, and that was fine. What wasn't fine was what Mason found the next morning. He was up before 5, the way he always was, and out to the barn to feed and check the horses before light. The horses were agitated, standing at the back of their stalls, snorting, the particular body language of animals that have smelled something wrong and are still deciding whether to panic about it. He checked them over, found nothing. Checked the barn itself. Nothing. Then he walked the fence line along the western pasture and found it. 3 sections of wire cut clean, not broken from pressure, not corroded through. Cut. The kind of cut that required a tool and a person using it deliberately, probably in the dark. The section chosen was the one closest to the road, the one you could get to from the shoulder without driving onto the property, and the cuts were low, near the bottom of the fence rather than at the top, which meant whoever had done it knew about animals, knew that if you want livestock to wander, you don't cut high. The cattle hadn't gone through yet. The cuts were recent enough that the animals hadn't found them. Mason repaired the cuts without going back to the house first because the cattle would find them in daylight and he couldn't wait. He used wire from the kit in the barn truck and worked fast in the early gray light, his breath fogging in the cold, his jaw tight. When he went back to the house, Victoria was already in the kitchen. She'd heard him leave and hadn't gone back to sleep. He could tell from the look of her. That particular alertness of someone who'd been awake for some time listening. He told her about the fence. She put both hands flat on the kitchen table and was quiet for a count of 3. He's starting the pressure campaign, she said. What comes next, in your experience with him? Supply issues, financial pressure, something that can be explained as bad luck if you're looking at it from outside. Her voice was level. The goal isn't to destroy immediately, it's to exhaust, to make you spend energy on small fires until you don't have any left for the big one. How do you fight that? She looked at him. You don't fight each fire separately. You go to the source. She picked up her coffee cup. And you do it fast before he realizes you're not going to break the way he expected. Mason thought about Lily sleeping upstairs, about the note from a dead man telling his daughter to find someone with reasons of their own to fight. Carla Voss gets here day after tomorrow, he said. Between now and then, we document everything. Every cut wire, every vehicle I can't account for, every phone call from a number I don't recognize. He looked at Victoria. And you're going to tell me everything about Damien Cross that you didn't tell me the first night. Everything you held back because you were still deciding whether to trust me. She held his gaze. That's fair. I know it's fair. I'm asking if you'll do it. Yes, she said. All of it. Lily's footsteps hit the top of the stairs. Stomp, stomp, stomp. And then her voice came down ahead of her. Is Victoria still here? Mason and Victoria looked at each other across the kitchen table, across the spread of papers and the careful evidence of everything that was coming, and Victoria called back, Yes, I'm still here, before Mason could answer. Lily came clattering down the stairs and into the kitchen and immediately went to show Victoria a drawing she'd made the night before, a horse with an improbably large head and 6 legs, which Lily explained was because she'd run out of room on one side of the paper. Victoria looked at it with complete seriousness and said it was the best horse she'd seen in some time, which was probably the right answer. Mason put more coffee on and thought about cut fence wire and accelerating timelines and a black truck with no plates, and the particular anger that comes from knowing someone has decided you're manageable. He was going to show them they'd calculated wrong. Carla Voss arrived on a Tuesday in a gray sedan that had seen better decades, wearing a jacket with a coffee stain on the left lapel that she either hadn't noticed or had decided not to care about. She was 53, compact, with the kind of face that had probably been considered pretty once, and was now considered sharp, which was a better thing to be. She shook Mason's hand first, then Victoria's, and the way she looked at Victoria, quick, assessing, with something like cautious relief underneath, told Mason that whatever Carla had been expecting to find, the person standing in front of her was close enough. "You look terrible," Carla said to Victoria. "Thank you," Victoria said. "You look like you drove 11 hours. 12. There was construction outside Casper." She set her bag on the kitchen table and looked around the room. "Is this place secure?" "Secure as a ranch gets," Mason said. "I checked the property line this morning. Nobody on it that shouldn't be." "Good." As she pulled out a laptop and a device he didn't recognize, small, gray, plugged into a portable battery. "Signal blocker," she said, noticing his look. "Cheap version, but it works for the basics. I'd rather we were having this conversation without anyone picking it up on anything that has a chip in it." She looked at the counter. "Is that coffee recent?" "About 40 minutes. I'll take it anyway." He poured her a mug and she sat down and opened the laptop and they got to work. Carla had been building her own map for 4 months, she explained, working from the fraud division side of things, specifically the complaint that Victoria had filed back in January, before Cross had shut down her access to everything. The complaint had enough detail to open a file but not enough to compel discovery, which meant Carla had been trying to build the factual foundation through other means. Public records, corporate filings, a contact inside one of Cross's subsidiary banks, who was nervous and slow and careful and had been feeding her fragments. What she hadn't had was the internal accounting records. When Victoria laid out the contents of the 2 manila envelopes and the hard drive on the table, Carla went through them with a speed that suggested she'd been trained to read documents the way other people read road signs. Fast, automatic, the important things jumping out before the rest had registered. She didn't say much while she was reading. Occasionally she made a sound. After about 20 minutes, she sat back and picked up her coffee. "Where did your father get these?" she said. "A contact inside Cross's primary accounting firm," Victoria said. "He never told me her name. I think he was protecting her." "She's not there anymore," Carla said. "Left the firm about 14 months ago. I've been trying to locate her." She looked at the hard drive. "If this has what I think it has, she took copies before she left." "Can you find her?" "I have a better chance now that I know what I'm looking for." She tapped the pages. "Victoria, this is the mechanism. This is the actual engine of how he does it. If we can get a forensic accountant to certify these records and match them against the public filings, he'll know we have them," Victoria said. "Yes, which means we move fast or we don't move at all." Carla looked at Mason. "And you, the pattern here, your property is in the corridor. You understand what that means practically. It means he needs me gone or compliant before the infrastructure announcement," Mason said, "which means we're not talking months." "Weeks," Carla said. "Maybe less." She folded her hands on the table. "There's a federal infrastructure bulletin that's scheduled to go public in 40 days. Normally it would have been 18 months of public comment period, but the current administration fast-tracked it. Cross has been working toward that deadline. Every acquisition, every pressure campaign, 40 days is the horizon." Mason felt the number settle in his chest like a stone. 40 days. He looked at Victoria, who was looking at the table. "Then we can't wait for a perfect case," Victoria said. "We have to go public with what we have and let the evidence speak while there's still time." "Going public before the legal structure is in place gives him room to discredit the documents," Carla said. "He has media people. You know that." "I know." She looked up. "But sitting on this and building quietly gives him time to keep attacking the ranch, to keep attacking Mason's operation. She glanced at him. What happened to the supply contract with the Keller feed distributor? They called yesterday, Mason said. Said their delivery schedule was full for the next 6 weeks. They've been delivering to this ranch for 9 years. Carla wrote something down. That's him. That's Cross's people making calls. She looked at Mason. What else? He'd been keeping the list. He went through it. The cut fence wire, the black truck, the call from the bank asking him to come in and discuss his current lending situation, which he'd received on Thursday and which had never happened before. A call to Dale Hutchins' property from someone claiming to be a county assessor doing land value surveys. 2 of his regular contracted workers calling to say they'd found other work. As he listed them, Carla wrote them down and Victoria's expression got progressively tighter. Not with fear, but with a particular kind of controlled anger he was starting to recognize in her. The look that meant she was holding herself very still, because moving would mean losing something she needed to keep. This is the pattern, Victoria said when he finished. Exactly what he did to the companies he targeted. Small fires, like I told you, each one manageable on its own, all of them together designed to exhaust. He underestimated one thing, Mason said. What's that? Carla asked. I've been running this ranch short-handed and over budget for 3 years. I'm already used to putting out small fires. He picked up his coffee. It doesn't exhaust me. It just makes me angry. Carla looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Victoria. I like him, she said, in a tone that suggested she didn't say that often. I know, Victoria said. They spent the next 4 hours working through the documents methodically. Carla identifying which records had the clearest evidentiary value. Victoria filling in the context from her knowledge of her father's operation. Mason pulling up county records on his laptop to cross-reference the property patterns against what the document showed. It was detailed and slow and occasionally heated when Carla and Victoria disagreed about sequencing, which happened twice, and both times resulted in Victoria being right and acknowledging that she should have said so more clearly the first time. By mid-afternoon, they had something close to a structure. Not a case, not yet, but the skeleton of one. Lily came home from Dale's at 3:30, walked into a kitchen full of papers and tension and a stranger, and handled it by sitting next to Carla and asking her what she did for work. I investigate things, Carla said. Like a detective. Like a detective, but for money crimes. Lily considered this. Is it boring? Sometimes. Right now it's not. That's good, Lily said, and went to get a snack, satisfied. Carla watched her go. Then she looked at Mason with an expression that was harder to read than her professional ones, something personal in it, something that had nothing to do with documents or timelines. She know what's going on? Carla asked. Enough to know it's serious and not enough to be scared, Mason said. That's the balance I'm trying to hold. It's a hard one to hold. Yeah, he said. It is. That night, after Carla had taken the second bedroom and Lily was asleep, Mason went out to the barn alone. He did this occasionally when he needed to think, because the horses settled him in a way that nothing else did. Their smell, the sound of them breathing, the complete indifference they had to everything that didn't involve whether they were fed and whether they were safe. He sat on an overturned bucket in Argos's stall. The older gelding, who'd been with the ranch since Mason's father's time and who was comfortable with being used as furniture. And he sat there in the dark with a flashlight he wasn't turning on and thought about 40 days. He heard the barn door open, saw Victoria's silhouette in the frame, backlit from the yard light. I saw the light wasn't on, she said. I thought... She stopped. I'm fine, he said. Come in or don't. She came in, stood near the door, which was the right call. She'd learned quickly that you didn't crowd the horses if you didn't need to. Argos turned his head and looked at her with one large dark eye and went back to being unconcerned. I owe you an apology, she said. For what specifically? For bringing this to your door and letting you think you had more time to prepare than you do. She leaned against the barn wall. When Carla said 40 days, you didn't react. But I watched your face. I reacted, he said. I'm just quiet about it. I know. A pause. Mason, if you want me to take the documents and go, find somewhere else to work from, I would understand that. I brought this problem here. I could take it somewhere else. He was quiet for a moment. Where would you go? He asked. She was quiet too. Exactly, he said. So stop looking for a way to take responsibility for something Cross did and figure out how to fight him. He stood up. That's what the next 40 days are for. She looked at him in the dark. You're angry, she said. Not an accusation, just a noticing. Yes. At me? At the situation. He paused. Partially at myself for not seeing it sooner. The signs were there, the bank calls, the supply issues. I thought it was just the usual difficulty of keeping a ranch like this alive. Didn't occur to me it was coordinated. It's designed to not occur to you, she said. That's the whole mechanism. I know. He picked up the flashlight. But knowing that doesn't make me feel better about missing it. No, she said. It wouldn't. They walked back to the house in the cold without talking, and he thought about the fact that she hadn't tried to make him feel better about the thing he hadn't wanted to feel better about. Claire used to do the same thing, understand when reassurance would be the wrong call. It was a specific kind of intelligence, the kind that knew the difference between comfort and honesty. He didn't pursue that thought. He wasn't ready to. The next 4 days moved the way crisis days always do. Too fast in some ways, brutally slow in others. Carla worked 12-hour stretches, communicating with the fraud division through channels she wouldn't fully explain, and with a forensic accountant she trusted who was reviewing digital copies of the hard drive's contents from a location she also wouldn't disclose. Victoria worked beside her on the research end, filling in the historical context of Sterling Meridian's operations, occasionally pacing the kitchen when something wasn't adding up, occasionally going very quiet in a way that meant she'd found something and wasn't ready to talk about it yet. Mason ran the ranch and documented everything. The next thing to go wrong was the water pump on the south field. He found it on a Wednesday morning, not broken down, but tampered with. A specific valve bypassed in a way that would eventually flood the lower pasture and damage the root systems of the winter crop he'd put in the ground 6 weeks ago. He stood looking at it for a while before he fixed it, and he took photographs first, and he called Jerry Fitch and left a message with the specific details. Then he called Bill Hadley. It's moving faster, he told Bill. Bill was quiet. Then he said, Hal Morrison's water rights claim got flagged by the county. Out of nowhere. Somebody filed an objection. Who filed it? Entity called Meridian Land Solutions. Can't find a physical address for it. Meridian. Mason thought about that. Close enough to Sterling Meridian Group to be a deliberate taunt, or a lazy mistake by someone who didn't think anyone would notice the name. I need you to call every rancher you know in a 20-mile radius, Mason said. Anyone who's had anything unusual in the last 2 months, supply problems, personnel problems, financial inquiries they didn't ask for. I need to know the full scope. Bill said he would. It took 2 days to get the picture. When it came back, it was worse than Mason had expected. 11 properties in the county corridor. 9 of them had experienced at least one anomaly in the last 60 days. 3 of them had received formal legal notices, county tax disputes, easement challenges, or the same kind of falsified debt collection paperwork that had been used against Victoria. None of them had connected the incidents to each other because each one had been designed to look isolated. When Mason laid it out on the kitchen table next to Carla's documents, Victoria looked at the pattern and said, He's done this before. Not this county, not these people, but the methodology. The distribution of pressure so no single person sees the whole picture. Until now, Carla said. She was looking at the map Mason had drawn, rough but accurate. The property lines marked in pencil, the incidents noted in red. This is actually better for us than I expected. She looked at Mason. Can you get these people in a room? Some of them, he said, the ones I know personally. I don't need all of them. I need enough that when this goes to a federal judge, the pattern has human faces attached to it. She looked at Victoria. And I need you to be prepared to stand up publicly, not just evidence, you, in front of people, saying what happened. Victoria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I know. He's going to put you through a media cycle first. You know that. He's been laying groundwork for months, but by the stories about your father's company, the criminal investigation suggestions. I know, Carla. Victoria, I said I know. Quiet. Final. Set up the meeting. The meeting happened on a Saturday in Mason's barn because it was large enough and private enough, and because Mason's barn was Mason's, and there was something in that. In gathering on land that was being threatened, in the specific fact of standing on it and choosing not to leave it, that he felt mattered. 9 ranchers came. Some he knew well, some he knew only by name. They came in trucks, mostly, the way people in this part of Montana always went anywhere that required going. And they stood in the barn with the horses watching from their stalls and the smell of hay and cold air filling everything, and Mason stood in the middle of them and told them what he'd found out. He told it plainly. No dramatics, just facts. The documents, the pattern, the 40-day timeline, the infrastructure announcement that would make every piece of this land worth significantly more than it was currently valued at. Some of them already knew pieces of it. None of them had known all of it. Hal Morrison, who was 64 and had a face like a topographic map, said, "So we've all been getting squeezed by the same man, and none of us knew it." "That's about right," Mason said. "And this woman," Hal looked at Victoria, who was standing slightly apart in a way that was not quite comfortable, but not quite not. "She has proof." "We have proof," Mason said. "She found it. I helped her get it out. Carla here is the one who can use it legally." Carla, leaning against a support post, nodded. Hal looked at Victoria for a long moment. Victoria met his gaze without flinching, which he seemed to respect. "What do you need from us?" he asked. "Your stories," Carla said. "In writing, as formally as you're comfortable with, notarized if possible. Dates, descriptions, names of whoever contacted you." She paused. "And your willingness to stand behind them if this goes to court." The barn was quiet. Not the quiet of reluctance. The quiet of people who are calculating the cost of a thing and deciding whether they're willing to pay it. Tom Eggers, who ran cattle on the north side of the corridor and who had barely said a word since he arrived, said, "My grandfather homesteaded the North 40. My dad ran it. I've been running it for 31 years. He looked at no one in particular. "Nobody's taken that." That was the closest thing the meeting had to a speech. They left one by one with Carla's contact information and Mason's phone number, and by the time the barn was empty again, the light was going gold and cold through the high windows, and the horses were getting impatient about their evening feed. Victoria helped him feed them. She was getting better at it, at moving in the barn, at reading what the horses wanted from her, at not being tense around something large that had its own opinions. She still wasn't natural at it, but she was less wrong about it than she'd been 2 weeks ago. "They trust you," she said, meaning the ranchers. "Some of them do. Some of them came because they're scared and didn't know what else to do." He tossed hay into Argos's stall. "Doesn't matter why they came. They came." "Do you think they'll follow through?" "Hal Morrison will." He moved to the next stall. "When Hal decides something, it stays decided. The rest will follow Hal." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Cross is going to find out about this meeting. There's no way 9 ranchers all know something without it getting back. I know. He's going to escalate. I know that too." She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "Mason, are you scared?" He thought about the honest answer. "Yeah," he said, "mostly about Lily." Something shifted in her face. "I think about her too," she said, "about whether..." Whatever she was going to say, she stopped herself. He didn't push it. She went back to the hay, and he went back to the feed, and they worked through the rest of the stalls in the particular kind of quiet that happens between people who have stopped performing ease around each other because there isn't time for it. It was 3 days later that the sabotage happened. Mason smelled the smoke before he saw it. He came out of the house at 5:40 in the morning, and the wind was wrong, carrying something from the direction of the equipment shed, and the something was chemical and hot. He ran. The shed wasn't on fire, but it had been. Someone had started it at the rear corner. He could see the char marks, the melted section of the plastic ventilation cover, the blackened ground where accelerant had been poured and ignited. What had saved it was the rain 2 nights earlier, still damp in the ground and in the dry grass around the structure. And the fire had burned itself out after eating about 12 square feet of the exterior wall before running out of the dry material it needed to go further. If the ground had been drier, he would have lost the shed and everything in it, 2 tractors, the winter feed stocks, the equipment he needed to run the ranch through the next 4 months. He stood in the cold dawn looking at the burn marks and felt something shift in him. Not panic, not even more anger, though the anger was there. Something colder and more deliberate than anger. He called Carla first. She was at his kitchen table in under 3 minutes, still in her pajamas, phone already in her hand. "He's done waiting," she said. "Yeah." This changes the timeline. He escalates this fast, it means he's nervous. Something we've done has made him nervous. She looked at him. "That's actually useful. Tell that to my equipment shed." "I know." She had the decency to not make it clinical any further. "I'm sorry, Mason." Victoria came out of the house. She looked at the shed, at the burn marks, at Mason's face. She didn't say she was sorry or anything else that would have been inadequate. She stood next to him and looked at what had been done to his land, and her jaw was tight, and her eyes were clear and angry. "Okay," she said. "We go public. Now. We don't wait for perfect." "The forensic accountant hasn't finished," Carla started. "He just set fire to Mason's property, with Lily asleep in that house." Victoria's voice was even and very hard. "We don't wait." Carla looked at Mason. Mason looked at the burn marks on the wall of his shed, at the blackened ground, at the clear, cold Montana sky coming up pale over the ridge where he'd buried Claire, between two cottonwoods that would turn gold in 2 months if everything was still standing by then. "We go public," he said. "Set it up." Going public was not the clean, decisive moment that the phrase implied. It was Carla on 3 phones at once, while Victoria drafted a statement at the kitchen table and revised it 4 times because the first 3 versions were either too measured or too personal. And Mason drove Lily to Dale Hutchins' place at 6 in the morning with a bag packed for 2 nights and a cover story about a plumbing problem that Lily accepted with the particular suspicion of a child who knows she's being managed but can't prove it. "You'll call me?" Lily said, standing in Dale's driveway in her winter coat, holding her backpack straps with both hands. "Twice a day," Mason said. "What if something bad happens?" He crouched down to her level. She had those eyes, Claire's eyes, looking at him with a directness that made it impossible to be anything less than honest. "Some difficult things are happening with the ranch," he said. "I'm working to fix them. You staying here for a couple of days helps me fix them faster, because I'm not worried about you while I'm working." She thought about this. "Is Victoria helping you?" "Yes." "Is she good at it?" "She's very good at it." Lily nodded slowly, satisfied. "Okay," she said. "But you have to call me before 8, or I'll already be asleep." He kissed the top of her head and drove back to the ranch, and didn't let himself think about the fear that had been sitting under his sternum since he'd smelled the smoke 3 mornings ago, because thinking about it didn't help anything, and there was too much to do. The statement went out through 2 channels simultaneously: a direct submission to a federal fraud division contact that Carla had been cultivating for months, and a carefully documented press package sent to 3 journalists that Carla trusted, chosen because they had track records of protecting sources and because none of them had known connections to Cross's media operation. The package included a summary of the documented evidence, a description of the pattern of attacks on properties in the Keller County corridor, and Victoria's formal account of what had been done to her family's company. Victoria's name was on it, her photograph, her signature. She'd been the one to insist on that. "He's going to use it," Carla had said the night before they sent it. "The moment your name is public and attached to this, he activates his media people." "I know." The narrative he's been building: unhinged heiress, fraudulent claims, personal vendetta. Carla. Victoria had looked at her steadily. "I know exactly what he's going to do. I've watched him do it to other people. And the answer to being called a liar is not to hide. It's to be visible." She'd paused. "My father's name is in these documents. The things that were done to him are in these documents. I'm not putting them out into the world without my name attached." Carla had looked at Mason, who had kept his expression neutral because it wasn't his call to make. "Okay," Carla said. "Your name on it." The response came faster than any of them expected. By 10 in the morning, the day the package went out, the first story had been picked up by a regional news outlet. By noon, it had moved to 2 national financial publications. By 3 in the afternoon, Carla's phone was getting calls from numbers she recognized as belonging to Cross's legal team, not returning them, just watching them come in and logging them. And by 5 that evening, the counter-narrative began. It came through a media outlet that Mason had never heard of, but Victoria recognized immediately. A financial news site that looked independent and was not. The story was fast and well-written and said almost exactly what Carla had predicted. Sterling heiress makes fraud claims against prominent developer amid personal financial collapse. Sources close to the situation describe a pattern of erratic behavior following the death of her father. Documents cited by Ms. Sterling's legal team are described by independent experts as misinterpreted at best, fabricated at worst. Mason read it over Victoria's shoulder at the kitchen table. Independent experts, he said. Cross's consultants. He keeps 3 of them on retainer for exactly this purpose. Her voice was steady, but her hand, resting on the table, had closed into a loose fist. This is the part where most people break, she said, where you start to wonder whether you've made a mistake, whether the evidence is actually as solid as you thought, whether you should have waited longer or moved faster, or, is the evidence solid? Mason asked. She looked at him. Yes. Then this is noise, he said. You said it yourself. He's replacing your reputation with a story he's writing. The answer isn't to argue with the story, it's to make the real one louder. She looked at him for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a moment. You would have been good in a boardroom, she said. I don't want to be in a boardroom. I know, she said. I meant it as a compliment. The calls from the ranchers started coming in the next morning. Hal Morrison first, then Tom Eggers, then the others in a loose sequence over the course of 2 hours, each one having seen the news, each one checking in, each one saying a version of the same thing. We're still with you. What do you need? It was Hal who told Mason that 2 more ranchers who hadn't come to the barn meeting had called him to ask how they could add their names to whatever was being built. Word travels, Hal said. Fast, Mason agreed. Mason. Hal's voice shifted slightly. The particular shift of a man in his 60s who has seen enough bad things to know when one is close. You and the girl be careful. Man like Cross doesn't stop with fence wire and burned sheds. I know, Hal. You need anything from me. Anything at all. You call. I'll call. What Mason hadn't expected, and what changed the shape of the next week substantially, was the woman who called Carla on a Thursday morning and identified herself as a former employee of Cross's primary accounting firm. Her name was Diane Marsh. She was 47, had worked in the firm's compliance division for 9 years, and had left 14 months earlier under circumstances she described as voluntary and that Carla described later as almost certainly coerced. She had seen the news coverage. She had spent 48 hours deciding whether to call. She had called. She was exactly who Victoria's father had been protecting. The conversation between Diane and Carla lasted 3 hours, and Mason sat in the kitchen for most of it listening to Carla's side. The careful questions, the long silences while Diane talked, the moments where Carla's voice went very neutral, the way it did when she was trying not to let on that she'd just heard something significant. When it was over, Carla came to the kitchen table and sat down and was quiet for a moment. She kept copies, Carla said. Not the same records as your father's safe. Different records. The internal compliance flag she raised internally before she left. The formal objections she filed inside the firm that were ignored and then deleted from the system. She looked at Victoria. They deleted them. She kept a personal record. Victoria closed her eyes briefly, opened them. Can she testify? She wants to. That's why she called. Carla rubbed the back of her neck. She's scared. She's been scared for 14 months. But she said watching the story get published and watching Cross's people immediately go after you. She looked at Victoria. She said it made her angry enough to stop being scared. She's going to need protection, Victoria said. I'm working on it. Carla was already picking up her phone again. This changes the evidentiary picture substantially. With her testimony and the internal compliance records alongside your father's documents, we're not building a case anymore. She paused. We have one. The next 12 days were the longest Mason had experienced since the months after Claire died, and they had a similar quality to them. The sensation of time moving at 2 speeds simultaneously, too fast when he needed to think, and unbearably slow when he was waiting. The Federal Fraud Division formally opened an expanded investigation on a Tuesday. 3 days later, a federal judge issued a preservation order against Cross's primary holding company, which meant they couldn't move or destroy documents while the investigation was active. The order was sealed initially, but Cross's lawyers would have known about it within hours, and the response was immediate. The story that came out the following morning was the one Carla had been most worried about. It ran in a major national outlet, one with genuine credibility, which meant Cross had either bought someone inside it or had used something he was holding over someone. The headline was careful and devastating. Former Sterling executives' fraud claims undercut by own financial history. The story quoted unnamed sources describing Victoria's management of a subsidiary company in the final years before her father's death. A subsidiary that had posted losses, that had been restructured twice, that had involved a business decision that could be framed, with the right emphasis, as reckless. The story didn't call her a criminal. It didn't need to. It created doubt, which was the whole mechanism. Mason read it alone before Victoria came downstairs. He made coffee. He thought about how to be useful instead of angry. When Victoria came into the kitchen and saw his face, she said, "Show me." He turned the laptop toward her. She read it standing up. He watched her face while she read. The careful neutrality she maintained, the single moment near the end of the piece where something flickered in her eyes that wasn't anger or fear, but something older and more tired than either. She straightened up. "The subsidiary restructuring," she said. "I made a judgment call on a contract that cost us about $18 million over 2 years. It was a bad call. I knew it was a risk, and I took it, and I was wrong." Her voice was even. "I've never hidden that. Is there anything in that story they can actually use against the fraud claims?" Mason asked. "No." She pulled out the chair and sat. "It's character pressure. They're not trying to disprove the documents. They're trying to make me someone the public doesn't want to believe." She looked at him. "It's going to get worse before the trial." "I know." She looked at the coffee he'd poured for her. Then she looked at him. "How are you holding up?" It was the first time she'd asked him that directly, and the question landed differently than he expected. Most of the asking in the last 3 weeks had been practical. Logistics, evidence, timelines. This was something else. "I'm managing," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "I'm tired," he said. "I'm behind on about 15 things that needed doing on the ranch before winter. I miss my daughter being home. And I keep thinking about the burn mark on the equipment shed wall and what would have happened if the ground had been drier." She was quiet. "But I'm okay," he said. "I'm better when there's something to do." "Me too," she said. Then, after a pause, "I owe you an explanation about something." "The subsidiary." "No. Well, yes, eventually, but right now I mean—" She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug in that way she had, the anchor gesture. "When I first came here, I told you I'd researched you and made a judgment call, and that's true. But there was also—" She stopped and started over. "I was out of options and I was exhausted, and I drove to this ranch because on paper it made strategic sense. But when I pulled up to that door in the rain, what I was actually doing was hoping, not calculating, hoping that the person who opened the door would be—" She pressed her lips together briefly. "I didn't expect you to be what you are." "Which is what?" She met his eyes. "Someone who opens the door," she said simply. He didn't know what to do with that, so he looked at his coffee, and the moment passed, and Carla came in from the back room with her laptop, and the morning took over the way mornings in a crisis always did. The formal proceedings began 3 weeks after the investigation went public. The Federal Fraud Division moved faster than Carla had hoped, and slightly slower than the timeline required, which meant the infrastructure announcement came out while the case was still in preliminary hearings. But with enough of the evidence public and enough of the investigation visible that the announcement landed differently than Cross had planned. Instead of a windfall, it landed in the middle of a fraud case that had his name all over it. The preservation order expanded. 3 of his subsidiary companies were placed under receivership while the investigation continued. His media people kept working, but the counter-narrative had lost momentum. It was harder to call Victoria unhinged when she was standing in front of a federal grand jury reading from documents that matched, line by line, with records 3 other witnesses had independently confirmed. Diane Marsh testified for 6 hours over 2 days. She was careful and specific and occasionally shook, Not performing fear, just experiencing it, because she had spent 14 months living with the knowledge of what she knew, and she was still not entirely sure she was safe. When she finished the second day and walked out of the building, Victoria was waiting outside on the steps. They'd never met. Victoria knew her only from what Carla had told her, the woman who'd kept records nobody was supposed to keep, who'd stayed scared for over a year and then gotten angry enough to make the call. "Thank you," Victoria said. Diane Marsh looked at her for a moment. She had tired eyes and a careful face, and she said, "Your father hired a private investigator to make sure I was okay after I left the firm. I didn't know that until last year." She paused. "I thought you should know that he looked out for me even when things were falling apart." Victoria didn't say anything. She nodded. Diane walked to her car, and Carla appeared at Victoria's shoulder and said, "You ready?" And Victoria said, "Yes." And they went back inside. The day Victoria testified, Mason drove 4 hours to sit in the courthouse hallway because he wasn't permitted in the hearing room. He brought coffee and a thermos and a book he didn't read, and sat on a bench and waited. Hal Morrison had driven down too, without being asked, and sat nearby working through what appeared to be a farming supply catalog with a red pen, circling things. They didn't talk much. After the second hour, Hal said, "My father lost a piece of land once to a man like this, back in the 70s. Took it legally, but the legal part was built on a lie." He didn't look up from the catalog. Spent the rest of his life angry about it. Not the land, the lie. "Did he ever get it back?" Mason asked. "No." Hal turned a page. "But I think about what would have happened if he'd had somebody to fight it with." He glanced at Mason sideways. "Turns out that matters." Mason thought about that for the rest of the wait. Victoria came out at 2:30, looking like she'd been in a room for 5 hours, working very hard to stay controlled, and had mostly succeeded. She saw Mason on the bench and stopped walking. "You drove 4 hours," she said. "I had things to do in the city anyway," he said, which was not true and which she knew was not true. She sat down next to him on the bench. Not close, just next to him. She didn't say anything else, and he didn't say anything else. And after a minute she exhaled slowly, the long, deliberate exhale of someone putting down something very heavy for a moment before they have to pick it up again. "How did it go?" he asked. "They tried to rattle me with the subsidiary," she said. "Cross's lawyers, the restructuring, the losses." She paused. "I told them exactly what I told you, that I made a bad call, and I knew it was a risk, and I was wrong." Another pause. "Then I told them that making a bad business decision is not the same as committing fraud, and that the difference between those two things was precisely what was under discussion, and that I was happy to explain it in further detail if they needed me to." Mason looked at her. "How'd they take that?" "Not well." Something that wasn't quite a smile moved across her face. "But that's their problem." The verdict, when it came on a gray November morning, 15 months after the investigation had formally opened, 7 months after the preliminary hearings had concluded, and on a day when Mason was at the ranch repairing the north fence line because the work had to be done regardless of what was happening in a courtroom 4 hours away. Carla called him. He stopped working, stood in the cold pasture holding a fence post in one hand and his phone in the other. "Guilty," Carla said. "All primary counts, federal fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and the land acquisition charges." A pause, and he could hear something in her voice that wasn't her professional tone, something looser and more human. "They got him, Mason." He stood in the pasture for a moment. "Victoria," he said. "She's here. She's—" Carla paused again. "She's okay. She's better than okay." He drove to the city that afternoon and found Victoria outside the courthouse on the same steps where she'd talked to Diane Marsh months earlier, standing in the cold with her coat buttoned wrong, second button in the first hole crooked all the way down, which told him she'd dressed in a hurry that morning and hadn't noticed, talking to Carla and a man from the fraud division he recognized from 2 earlier meetings. She saw him come up the courthouse steps, and she stopped talking mid-sentence. He looked at her. She looked at him. She had been crying, not recently, but recently enough that her eyes still showed it, and she had the slightly wrecked look of someone who has held a very tight thing for a very long time and has just been allowed to set it down. You drove 4 hours again, she said. I had things to do, he said, same as before. She laughed, a real one, short and involuntary, surprised out of her. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around him and held on. And he let her. And it was awkward for about a second in the way that things are when two people who've been careful about something suddenly stop being careful, and then it wasn't awkward at all. Carla looked away at the courthouse facade with elaborate interest. When Victoria stepped back, her coat was still buttoned wrong. Mason looked at it and looked at her and didn't say anything about it, because some things you let be imperfect without comment. Come home, he said. Lily's been asking about you for 3 days. Victoria looked at him. Home, she repeated like she was testing the word. The ranch, he said, because it was true, and because it was the only answer he had, and because the way she looked when he said it was the same way she'd looked the first morning she'd made eggs in his kitchen in his wife's old flannel shirt, like something was coming back into focus that she'd thought she'd lost for good. Okay, she said, let's go home. The drive back to the ranch took 4 hours and 12 minutes, which Mason knew because Lily called at the 2-hour mark to ask where they were, and called again at 3 hours and 40 minutes to ask if they were almost there, and called a third time at 4 hours and 5 minutes to say that Dale's wife had made pie, and she'd saved a piece for Victoria, but not for Mason because he'd been gone too long. That's not fair, Mason said. You were gone 4 days, Lily said. Victoria was gone longer. I was gone 4 days because Victoria was gone longer. That's not my problem, Lily said, with the magnificent indifference of a 6-year-old, and hung up. Victoria, in the passenger seat, had been listening. She turned to look out the window so he wouldn't see her laughing. He saw it anyway, in the shake of her shoulders. She saved you pie, he said. I know. Victoria's voice had that quality it got sometimes, warm and slightly undone, the tone she used when Lily had gotten to her and she wasn't trying to hide it. She's going to be extraordinary. She's already trouble. Same thing, usually. They drove in the dark with the heater going and the mountains invisible on either side, but present the way they always were, felt rather than seen. A weight of landscape that had nothing to do with what was visible. Mason had driven this road so many times in his life that he could feel every curve in his hands before it arrived, and tonight it felt different not because the road had changed, but because the passenger seat wasn't empty. He didn't pursue that thought too far. He'd been doing that a lot lately, getting to the edge of something and stopping, not out of fear exactly, but out of a careful instinct that some things should be approached slowly. That you don't rush toward the things that matter, because rushing was how you got there before you were ready. When they pulled up to the ranch, the porch light was on. Dale's truck was in the drive, and Lily was already at the door in her pajamas, even though it was 9:30, which meant Dale's wife had lost that particular battle some time ago. She pushed past the screen door and down the porch steps in her socks, which was going to mean wet socks, and launched herself at Victoria first. Victoria caught her, held her. Lily's arms went around her neck the way they went around Mason's. The full commitment hold, no reservation. Victoria's eyes closed for just a second. Then Lily leaned back and looked at her face with the clinical attention she used when she was checking someone for damage. You were crying, she said. Earlier, Victoria said. Not bad crying. The other kind. Lily appeared to accept this taxonomy. Do you want pie now or in the morning? In the morning. I think we all need to sleep. Okay. Lily turned to Mason. You don't get pie in the morning either. There it is, Mason said. Dale and his wife left shortly after, with Dale squeezing Mason's shoulder in the hallway in the wordless way that men of a certain age in Montana express things they consider too important to say out loud. Mason locked the door behind them and stood in the quiet of his own house and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness, which was too simple a word, but something like the return of pressure to a space that had been holding a vacuum. The trial's aftermath took months to fully resolve, the way these things always do, because the legal machinery that ends something like what Damian Cross had built is not a switch you flip, but a process you endure. His assets were frozen the week of the verdict. Receivership proceedings moved through 3 of his primary holding companies over the following month. The forensic accountants working for the fraud division spent 11 weeks combing through the financial records, and the picture they assembled was, in Carla's words, The most comprehensively documented corporate fraud scheme she'd encountered in 22 years of this work. The victims were many and varied: 15 properties in 4 states, 7 businesses, 3 families who had lost nearly everything and had spent years believing they had no recourse, no proof, no story that anyone would take seriously. The Wyoming family, the equipment company, the son who had run out of money before his case reached trial, were located by Carla's team in February. They had relocated twice since losing the business. The son, who was 34 now and working construction, cried on the phone when Carla told him what was happening. Not because of the money, which was partial and complicated and would take another year to finalize, because someone had believed him. Victoria oversaw the victim restitution process personally, working with Carla and the Fraud Division Civil Recovery Team. She had access again to her father's records, her father's company's records, the documentation of what had been built over 30 years and what had been systematically dismantled over 8 months. The process of unwinding Cross's acquisitions was slow and imperfect. Some things couldn't be fully restored because time doesn't reverse, and the years people spent without what was taken from them don't come back when the money does. She understood that more clearly than anyone. The partial restoration of her family's assets, the pieces of Sterling Meridian Group that were recoverable, the accounts that were unfrozen, the legal standing that had been stripped and was now returned, felt smaller than she'd expected. Not because the money wasn't real, but because she'd spent 15 months learning that the money had never been the point. Her father had built something. Cross had tried to take it and failed. What remained wasn't just what she recovered from the receivership proceedings. It was the knowledge of how her father had operated, the care he'd taken, the woman he'd protected at the cost of her anonymity, the documents hidden in a Montana basement that were meant to be found when everything else was gone. He'd built toward that contingency with the same deliberateness he'd built toward every other one. She thought about the note he'd left in the safe. The most important thing is to find one person with reasons of their own to fight. She thought she understood now what he'd actually meant. Not a tactical recommendation, a different thing entirely. The foundation was her idea, though Carla claimed she'd had the same thought 3 weeks earlier and had been waiting for Victoria to get there on her own. It was incorporated in March under the name the Harlan Sterling Protective Trust, her father's first name, not his last, because it was for him in a personal sense and not a corporate one. The mandate was specific: legal resources and financial advocacy for small landowners and business operators facing predatory corporate acquisition tactics. The kind of threat that was designed to be invisible until it was too late. The kind that worked precisely because each individual target lacked the resources to see the whole picture. Victoria funded it with the first tranche of the recovered assets and brought in 2 attorneys from the Fraud Division Civil Team who were looking to move to nonprofit work, and Diane Marsh, who had spent 14 months being scared and was done with that and wanted to do something with the knowledge she had. Carla served on the board in an advisory capacity and complained about board meetings with a consistency that suggested she actually didn't mind them much. She set up the trust's operational base in Billings, 40 minutes from the ranch, because the foundation needed a real address and a real office, and because 40 minutes was manageable. It was Mason who pointed out that 40 minutes was manageable when they were discussing logistics in the kitchen one evening in early spring. Victoria had looked at him when he said it, something measuring in the look, something that was also a question. "I wasn't planning to leave," she said. "I didn't say you were. You were checking." "I was clarifying," he said. "There's a difference." She smiled at that. The full one, not the small, careful version. "I'm not leaving, Mason." He nodded. Went back to the coffee he'd been making. "The office in Billings is a good idea. You'll need somewhere with actual infrastructure." "I know." She paused. "I've also been looking at office space on the 2nd floor of the building that houses the County Agricultural Extension Office. Small space, cheap lease, and it puts the foundation directly accessible to the ranching community in the county. You've been thinking about this for a while." "I've been thinking about a lot of things for a while." He turned to look at her. She was leaning against the kitchen counter in jeans and one of his flannel shirts. Not the ones he'd lent her that first night, but her own, bought in town 3 months ago, though they looked the same. She'd stopped wearing the things she'd arrived in almost entirely, except for work meetings in the city. He'd noticed and hadn't said anything about it. "Stay," he said, not as a question. She held his gaze. I know it's not a question, she said quietly. It was Lily who told Victoria about Claire, not Mason. Mason had told Victoria the basic facts early on. His wife, 3 years ago, cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. The facts were enough to explain the architecture of the life Victoria had walked into. He hadn't gone further because going further required something he didn't freely give, which was the interior version of it, the specific texture of that particular grief. But Lily talked about her mother the way children talk about the dead when they haven't been taught yet to perform sadness around it. Naturally, incidentally, in the middle of other conversations. She told Victoria about the garden Claire had started on the south side of the house that Mason kept watering every spring because he didn't know what else to do with it. She told Victoria about the way Claire laughed, which was loud and slightly too much for the room, which was a quality Mason had loved about her and which Lily had apparently inherited precisely. She told Victoria about the October when Claire had been sick, but not yet very sick, and they'd all raked leaves together, and her mother had thrown a pile of leaves at her father and hit him in the face, which was the funniest thing Lily had ever personally witnessed. Victoria listened to these things the way she listened to Lily in general, completely, without performing attention, with the kind of focus that made Lily feel like the most interesting person in the room, which she usually was. She told Mason about one of these conversations once, obliquely. He was quiet for a moment. She talk about her a lot? He asked. When something reminds her. She doesn't make a thing of it. She just mentions her the way you'd mention anyone. Victoria paused. She talks about her the way you'd want someone to talk about you, like she was real and funny and present, not like she was something sad that happened. Mason nodded, looked at the window. That's Claire, he said. She was very hard to make sad. Victoria didn't say anything. She didn't try to make the moment into something. She just let it be what it was, which was what she always did, and which was, he had slowly come to understand, one of the specific things that had made him trust her before he'd had a rational reason to. The proposal was in August, in the barn. Not because Mason had planned it that way. He hadn't planned much at all, which was unlike him in some ways and very like him in others. He'd bought the ring in June from a jeweler in Billings who'd shown him 17 options, and he'd picked the one that looked most like something a person actually chose, rather than something a person was supposed to choose. He'd had it in the drawer of his nightstand for 6 weeks because there was always something happening, always a reason the moment wasn't quite right, and eventually he'd realized that he was doing what he always did, waiting for conditions that would never be entirely right before doing the thing that was already decided. It was an August evening, cooling fast the way August evenings in Montana do, and Victoria was in the barn because one of the mares had been restless all afternoon, and she'd taken to checking on her when that happened. She'd developed a relationship with the horses that surprised him still, not the fluency he had, nothing like that, but a genuine ease that had replaced the careful correctness of those early weeks. The mare, particularly, had decided she was acceptable. Mason came in and found Victoria leaning against the stall door talking to the horse in a low voice, not words exactly, but the sounds people make when they're addressing animals and don't need to make sense. The mare had her head out and her nose near Victoria's shoulder. She settled down? He asked. Mostly. Victoria didn't turn around immediately. She just wanted company, I think. Yeah, he said. She does that. He stood there for a moment. The barn smelled like hay and horse and the particular dusty, warm smell that barns accumulate over decades of being barns. The light was the long amber light of August evening coming through the high windows. The mare snorted softly. He thought about being 23 years old in this barn with his father, repairing something he couldn't now remember, and his father saying that the most important decisions a man makes are the ones he makes before he fully understands what he's deciding. He thought it was a confusing thing to say at the time. He understood it now. Victoria, he said. She turned around. He had the ring in his hand. He hadn't rehearsed anything because rehearsed things came out wrong when he said them, and this was not a situation in which he wanted things to come out wrong. I'm not good at the version of this where I say a lot of things, he said, so I'm going to say the true version, which is shorter. He looked at her. You showed up at my door in a storm and I let you in because something about you looked like it needed to be let in, and I have not once since then thought that was the wrong call. Not when the fence got cut, not when the shed burned, not through any of it. He paused. You've made this place different. You've made my daughter's life different. You've made mine different in ways I'm still figuring out, which I think I'd like to keep figuring out." Victoria was very still. Her hand had gone to the stall door, not gripping it, just resting there. "Marry me," he said. "Not because you need somewhere to be. You've got somewhere to be. You built it because you want to be here, because this is the place you keep choosing." She looked at him for a moment that felt long and wasn't. Her eyes were bright, and she was holding her jaw in that way she did when she was keeping something together. "Your coffee is still only adequate," she said. "I know. The north fence needs work again. I know. Lily is going to be insufferable about this. She'll probably take credit for it somehow," he said. "She has her theories about you arriving in a storm." Victoria laughed. The real laugh, the one that was slightly too much for the room. Then she stepped forward and put her hand over his, over the ring, and said, "Yes, obviously yes. Did you think I was going to say something else?" "I didn't know," he said honestly. "That's why it took me 6 weeks to ask." She looked at him. "You've had this for 6 weeks? There was always something happening. Mason." "I know." She shook her head, smiling, and let him put the ring on her finger, which it fit because he'd borrowed one of hers to get the size right, and she'd never mentioned noticing, which meant either she hadn't noticed or she'd noticed and decided to let him have it, and he strongly suspected the latter. The mare pushed her nose against Victoria's shoulder approvingly, or at least in a way that could be interpreted as approval if you were in the right frame of mind. Lily's response, the next morning, was to say, "I knew it," with a composure so absolute it was clear she had been prepared for this moment, and was handling it exactly as planned. She then asked immediately whether she could be in charge of flowers at the wedding, and when Mason said they hadn't gotten that far yet, she said, "I'm just thinking ahead," in a tone that was pure Claire. Mason looked at Victoria over his daughter's head. Victoria looked back at him. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that some things carry forward in people in ways you can't plan for and can't stop and wouldn't want to, even if you could. The wedding was in October, because October in Montana does things with light that no other month manages. The way the sky goes deep blue behind the yellow of the cottonwoods, the particular quality of the afternoon sun at that latitude in that season, low and warm and slightly amber, like everything is being seen through something golden. They'd talked about spring, and Victoria had said October, and Mason had said he knew why, and she'd said nothing because she didn't need to explain it. It was held at the ranch, in the pasture on the east side, the one that looked up toward the small cemetery on the rise, toward the 2 cottonwoods that had been gold for 2 weeks already. This had been a decision Mason had made privately and then told Victoria about, and she'd looked at him and said, "Yes," very simply, which was all there was to say. There were 63 people, not a large wedding, but a real one, the kind assembled from actual relationships rather than obligation or performance. Hal Morrison came in the suit he apparently only wore to funerals and weddings, and stood in the back with Tom Eggers, and cried with a complete lack of self-consciousness that Mason found both surprising and exactly right. Carla Voss wore a dress and complained about it to anyone who would listen. Diane Marsh came from Billings and sat near the front and was very quiet throughout, in the particular way of someone who is carrying something heavy and is also glad to be there. The 2 attorneys from the foundation came. Dale and his wife came, and his wife brought a casserole to the reception that nobody had asked for, and that was eaten completely. Lily wore a yellow dress that she had selected herself over the mild objections of Mason, who'd suggested something less likely to show grass stains, and she carried a basket of wildflowers that she distributed with a seriousness that suggested she understood the weight of the responsibility. When she reached the front and stood beside Victoria for the ceremony, she took Victoria's hand without being prompted, and Victoria's hand closed around hers and held on. Mason stood in front of these people who had driven through an October afternoon to witness something, and he looked at Victoria, in a dress that was not white but a warm ivory that caught the afternoon light, with her dark hair loose, with the ring already on her finger that he was about to formalize with another one, and he thought about the word home. He'd thought he knew what it meant. 3 generations of his family had lived on this land, and he'd grown up with the certainty that home was a place, something geographic and fixed, something that could be threatened and defended because it was concrete. He'd fought to keep it, and he would fight again to keep it, Because it mattered in every way land can matter to the people who've worked it. But standing in the cold October light watching Lily hold Victoria's hand, he understood something his father hadn't said, and his grandfather couldn't have known how to say. That the place was never the point. The place was just where the people were. Home was the accumulation of people who chose each other without being required to, who showed up without being asked to, who stayed because they wanted to, rather than because they had nowhere else to go. Victoria had come to this place in a storm with nothing. She had everything now. The restored assets, the foundation, the legal standing, the name that was no longer being rewritten by someone else's story. She could go anywhere. She stayed. That was the whole thing. That was all of it. The ceremony was short because Mason had asked for short. He said the words he meant and didn't add to them. And when he was done, Victoria said hers, which were slightly longer, and which included a sentence about adequate coffee that made Carla laugh from the third row and caused Hal Morrison to look confused. Lily presented the rings with enormous gravity, and then stepped back and watched the rest of the proceedings with her arms folded and an expression of deep proprietary satisfaction. Afterward, in the barn, which had been cleared and strung with lights for the reception, because October evenings in Montana are cold, and the barn was large, and it was the place where they'd first started planning how to fight, and it seemed right to celebrate there too. Mason stood near the door with a glass of something someone had put in his hand and watched his daughter teach Carla Voss to do a line dance that Lily had mostly invented on the spot. Carla was terrible at it and did not seem to care. Victoria appeared beside him. She'd been talking to Diane Marsh for 20 minutes, and her eyes were still slightly bright from that conversation. She leaned against the barn door near him and looked at the room, at these people filling this space where 7 months ago they'd stood in the dark and looked at burn marks on the wall and decided to stop waiting. "You okay?" she asked. "Very," he said. She nodded. Watched Lily demonstrate a dance move to Carla that seemed to involve stepping on her own feet. "I've been thinking about something," Victoria said. "Tell me." "The note my father left." She didn't look at him. "He said to find someone with reasons of their own to fight, and I spent months thinking that was strategic advice, that he meant find an ally, find someone with parallel interests." She paused. "But I don't think that's what he meant." "What do you think he meant?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think he meant that the only fight worth fighting is one you do alongside someone who has something to lose. Not just something to gain, something real at stake, something they built, something they love. Because that's the only kind of person who won't cut and run when it gets bad." She glanced at him sideways. "He'd never met you. He didn't know anything about you, but he knew the kind of person I'd need." Mason looked at the room. At Hal Morrison accepting a piece of wedding cake from Dale's wife. At Tom Eggers talking to one of the foundation attorneys with an attention that suggested he had things to say about property rights and had finally found someone paid to listen. At Lily, who had given up on teaching Carla and was now dancing with complete independence in the middle of the floor, eyes closed, entirely in her own world. "He was right," Mason said. "He usually was," Victoria said. "I didn't always tell him that." "I think he knew." She smiled, not the small, careful version, and not the surprised, involuntary one. A different smile. The specific one he'd seen grow across the last year. The one that belonged to a person who had stopped performing who she was and was just being it. It was better than the others. It cost something, and it gave something back. There are things about loss that people don't tell you. They tell you it gets easier, which is true but incomplete. What they don't say is that easier doesn't mean gone. It means integrated, folded into the structure of who you are so that it stops being a hole in the floor and becomes part of the floor itself. You still know it's there. On certain days you can feel exactly where it is, but you stop falling through it. Mason had been not falling for 3 years before that storm. He had maintained the ranch and raised his daughter and kept himself functional in all the ways that matter practically. And he had done it with the quiet stubbornness that was his most fundamental characteristic. He had not been looking for anything. He had not believed that looking was a thing he should be doing. And then a woman had knocked on his door in the rain with wrong shoes and forged documents and eyes that were direct and frightened and proud all at once. And he had let her in because something about her needed to be let in. and everything that followed had been difficult and sometimes dangerous, and not once had he doubted the original decision. That was the thing about the right call. It doesn't always feel right at the time. It feels complicated and risky and uncertain and occasionally like a significant mistake. But when you look back at it from the distance of months and seasons, it has a quality that the wrong calls don't have. It fits. It belongs in the sequence. You couldn't take it out without changing everything that came after, and everything that came after was worth keeping. The ranch was better than it had been in 3 years. Not because the fundamental difficulties of running a working ranch in Montana had resolved. They hadn't, and they wouldn't, because that was the nature of the work, and Mason had stopped expecting otherwise. But the financial pressure had eased with the return of the Keller County Water Corridor land to its rightful owners, which had included, ultimately, a formal restoration of Reedwood Ranch's water rights, claim that Cross's subsidiary had been quietly contesting through county channels for 8 months without Mason knowing. Settled, dismissed, gone. The supply contracts came back too. The feed distributor called 2 weeks after the verdict and said their schedule had opened up. Mason had said very little on that call and had not returned to that particular supplier because there are things you can forgive and things that go in a different category, and men who fold under pressure when it costs someone else something real go in the second category. He'd found a cooperative out of a county north that gave him better pricing anyway. The foundation's first year of operations assisted 11 families. Not all of them were saved. That was the honest accounting of it, because some situations had gone too far by the time they arrived. And some people didn't want the kind of help that came with paperwork and process, and the law doesn't always produce the outcome that justice would. Victoria knew this and had built it into the foundation structure from the beginning, the clear-eyed acknowledgement that helping was not the same as winning, that showing up mattered even when the outcome was incomplete. Diane Marsh ran the case intake with a thoroughness that reflected 14 months of living with things she should have been able to report and couldn't, and the foundation became in some ways a place where her particular kind of knowledge went from being something she'd been punished for to something that protected people. That transformation was not lost on her. She didn't talk about it much. She just did the work. Lily turned 7 in November, 2 months after the wedding, and requested a birthday party with 3 specific friends and a horse-themed cake that Mason ordered from a bakery in Billings, and that arrived with the horse inexplicably having 6 legs, which Lily announced was exactly right and placed as the centerpiece. She was, in every observable measure, a child who felt secure. She asked about her mother sometimes, and those conversations happened the way they should happen. Not avoided, not performed, just real. She had placed Victoria in a category of her own rather than trying to make her fit an existing one, which was the kind of categorical thinking that only very clear-eyed people manage, and it meant she could hold both things without them colliding. The mother she remembered and missed and would keep missing, and the woman who had come in a storm and stayed. These were not the same thing. They were not competing things. They were both true, simultaneously, and Lily at 7 apparently understood this better than most adults manage. One evening in the following spring, a May evening, the ranch green in a way it only gets for about 3 weeks before the summer dries it back down, Victoria was in the garden on the south side of the house. Not the vegetable beds, which were practical and which Mason managed. The other one. The one Claire had started. She'd been out there for an hour, and when Mason came around the corner, he stopped. She'd been weeding it. Not redesigning it, not reclaiming it in any grand sense, just doing the maintenance it needed. The kind of work that kept the existing plants going, the ones that had been watered every spring and kept quietly surviving. She had dirt on her hands and her knees, and she was entirely focused on what she was doing. He stood and watched her for a moment. She looked up and saw him, straightened up, looked at him without quite knowing what he was thinking, which was unusual for her. "Is this okay?" she asked. "I should have asked you first." "It's okay," he said. "I wasn't trying to—" "Victoria." He walked toward her. "It's okay." She looked at her dirty hands. "It needed work. I kept walking past it, and—" "Oh!" She stopped. She planted good things. They just needed some attention. He looked at the garden, at the plants Claire had put in the ground, some of them still going after 4 years, stubborn and perennial, coming back every spring whether anyone asked them to or not. "Yeah," he said, "they did." Victoria looked at him, and he looked at her, and something passed between them that didn't need to be said because it already was said. In the dirt on her hands, in the garden that was going to be fine, in the May evening and the green ranch and the sound of Lily somewhere inside the house making more noise than one child should be able to generate. There is a particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with declaration or drama. It's the kind that shows up in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday and does what needs doing, that tends to something neglected without being asked, that stays without making staying into a statement. It's the kind of strength that comes from people who have been genuinely broken and have learned the specific difference between breaking and being done. Victoria Sterling had had everything and lost everything, and found something in the space of that loss that the original everything hadn't contained. Not because losing things is good, it isn't, but because the things she'd found on the other side of it were things she'd had to choose with full knowledge of the cost. The ranch, the family, the man who opened the door in the storm. You can't choose what you don't know the value of. That was what the hard year had given her, not character. She'd had character before, something more specific than that. The knowledge of what she was choosing and why, and that she would choose it again. Mason would tell you, if you asked him years later, that the best decision he ever made was opening that door. He wouldn't say it dramatically. He'd say it the way he said most things, plainly, without embellishment, with the quiet certainty of a man who has stopped arguing with the things he knows. He'd also tell you it wasn't really a decision. It was just what you do when someone is standing in the rain. That's the part that's easy to miss, and maybe the most important part of all. Not the grand choices. The declaration, the stand, the fight you choose to finish. Those matter. But underneath them, earlier than them, is a smaller, simpler thing. The instinct to open the door when someone is outside of it, to let in what needs to be let in, to believe, without evidence before evidence is possible, that some things are worth the risk. 3 generations of Reeds had worked that land. The 4th was going to grow up knowing how it felt to fight for something real, to watch something taken be returned, to understand that the people who try to make you small can only succeed if you stay alone. Lily Reed was not going to stay alone. The May evening stretched long and gold over the mountains. Inside the farmhouse that had echoed for 3 years with a specific kind of quiet, something was cooking, and there were voices, and the cats were in the yard being generally useless, and the horses were settled in the barn. The lonely house was not lonely anymore. That was the whole story. Everything else was just what happened along the way.